Welcome to Dan Grausam from the next company. And over to you.
Well, thanks, Ellie, and the Arts Catalyst both for organizing what so far has been a really inspiring event. I'll try not to alter the course of that trajectory now. It's also been 2 years running that I've been able to self-medicate the arrival of an impending stack of exam scripts the size of a toddler by coming to events organized by the Arts Catalyst. It was the film festival and roundtable about nuclear film last year. So thanks for the continuing excitement of the spring. I guess I'm somewhat anomalous here, being primarily a scholar of literature, especially of post-1945 American literature with a focus on the Cold War. But I'm hoping that I can engage one of the themes that we're trying to foreground today concerning the legacies of the 1998 Atomic exhibition that Arts Catalyst organized, and also comment a little bit on the public unveiling of the Arts Catalyst archives. And is my volume okay? I'm good? Louder, okay. Just to comment on the legacies of the 1998 exhibit by turning to a very literal legacy of that exhibition, or rather a legacy made possible by James Accord's presence in the UK in 1998, namely James Flint's Book of Ash, 2004 novel, superb novel. And don't worry if you haven't read it, I'll outline it in a bit. I've known for some time that one of the dangers in working on living authors is that it was at least theoretically possible that one day you'd be presenting on one, only then find them in the audience. Sort of envy my scholars in medieval, or my colleagues in medieval and early modern for never having to face that. So there was one former colleague apparently who might have actually believed that could happen. Not in my current job, I assure you. And I've had actual presentation nightmares over the years. Waking up in a cold sweat after a nightmare, then giving a presentation, and as the Q&A begins, the author themselves asks the first question with a frown on their face. I've always treated that, though, as something like the equivalent of a reactor meltdown. Like, we all know it could happen, but we just go around pretending it's not going to happen until it does. And today it has. But luckily, having just had lunch with him, it turns out that Jim Flint is as lovely a man as he is talented a novelist, so I hope I don't offend. The talk I'm going to give is part of a larger research project. The project's called Half-Lives. It'll take the form of a monograph. It's a project which is trying to trace the legacies of the Cold War nuclear state post-1989 and 1991 to disrupt some of the ways we periodized cultural production in the 20th and 21st century in so many disciplines. 1989, 1991, and 9/11 have played a huge role in conceptualizing the shape of teaching, the shape of research projects, the shape of large periodizing gestures. I would argue, however, that when we turn to thinking about the nuclear legacies of the Cold War, instead of thinking of the Cold War as primarily an ideological conflict between two opposed ideological and economic systems, but instead thinking of the Cold War as a material project, and as a material project particularly defined by the nuclear aspects of that conflict, then we can really start to see the way that the Cold War remains a massively, comprehensively incomplete and unfinished project. In fact, we're not so much post-Cold War as we are in the Cold War's infancy, if we think about the Cold War primarily in terms of its radioactive legacies. And of course, wasn't a Cold War at all when we think radioactively. The figures almost defy comprehension. Since 1945, over 2,400 atomic and then thermonuclear weapons have been detonated on or in this planet in one of the largest uncontrolled human health experiments in history. And you will have noticed in Shelley's diagram of annual radioactive exposure that each of us receives. There was like a tiny little sliver of it that's still the result of fallout from the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, which categorically rethinks the idea of the Cold War nuclear subject, if you take that seriously. The fact that all of us bear material traces of weapons testing within our own bodies, potentially, as a result of background exposure. Now, I don't want to make too much of that. I don't want to sort of throw up my arms and say we're all downwinders, as it were, because that does a huge violence to the actual material histories of particular communities, though there are many of those particular communities. But to rethink a little bit about what we might mean by the Cold War subject, particularly when you realize that one of the material effects of the Cold War, the production of plutonium, is the production of a substance that remains toxic for 240,000 years, thereby dwarfing, as we've been discussing this morning, any of our conventional notions of risk assessment and risk preparation. So all this leads me to the Book of Ash. So, the plot of the novel. Jack Reaver is the supposedly dead father at the heart of the book. And he's based on the American sculptor James Accord, the subject of much of the extraordinarily interesting archival material on display today, and one of the participants in the 1998 Atomic exhibition. As you know at this point, Accord made the nuclear his subject, based for 15 years at Hanford, site of U.S. plutonium production for the Cold War weapons complex, among other things that it did. Accord sought to create a nuclear Stonehenge at the site, both a commemoration of and warning to the future about the toxic legacy of the location. And as many of you probably also know, Accord was particularly interested in contextualizing his work with nuclear materials within a longer history of sculpture and within a longer history of art. Some of his initial interest apparently came from the challenges faced by sculptors in combining disparate materials in a single piece of art. And volume is, am I now better? Okay. His initial interest stemmed from that sculptural challenge, a challenge that fascinated particularly as a sculptor of granite, given that granite already contains some naturally occurring uranium within it. So he was, in a sense, already working with a composite material, but became fascinated by, in a sense, extending that relationship between the supposedly non-radioactive and the radioactive in a single work. But this interest in combining different materials then opened up into a larger interest in transforming and transmutating materials. That's an especially interesting subject, obviously, when you're dealing with radioactive materials, given their constant radioactive decay, given their radioactive decay over time, sometimes somewhat unpredictable radioactive decay over the course of their half-lives and full lives. And I think this interest in alchemical transformation might be thought of not only as a technique in Accord's work, but as a metaphor for it. He sought art that could serve, as it were, to alchemically transform our understanding of the nuclear itself. Work that might pierce the veil of secrecy surrounding the nuclear state, revealing to us the deadly realities and strange beauties of federal nuclear sites, but also going from that, in a sense, backwards and forwards from a much more everyday sense of the nuclear. His projects really ranged from an understanding of the nuclear as it was contained in orange Fiesta-ware plates and smoke detectors all the way up through to the waste at Hanford site. Imagine a kind of radioactive continuum, as it were, from the foods we eat and the accoutrements of domestic life through to the reactor and weapons complexes of the American nuclear project. That seems to me to be his real genius, that ability to move our discussion of the nuclear age away from a handful of iconic sites and to see the way that those handful of iconic sites, places like Hanford, are really radiation extends on a much greater continuum. When we're talking about the radioactive state, we're not simply talking about Los Alamos, White Sands Missile Range, Nevada Test Site, Tennessee Valley, and Hanford, but in fact, a good swath of the US. Now, the genius of the Book of Ash, I think, is in precisely the same style. It once makes alchemical transformation a literary subject, but also a literary technique. It's a radioactive novel in the sense both of its subject and the way it transmutates novelistic style and content over time. The book opens with a postal problem. Cooper James is a youngish computer programmer at an American military installation in the UK. that works in either electronic surveillance or nuclear missile defense. In the heightened security atmosphere of post-9/11 politics, he's just received a metal canister in the mail, and it's filled with mysterious ash. Now, you recall this was at the time of huge fears of dirty bombs and anthrax scares sent through the postal system. And the military at this base is hardly in the mood for pranks of any kind. By the end of the first chapter, we've come to learn this canister contains, or supposedly contains, the ashes of Cooper's father, the artist Jack Reaver. Though even this requires a bit of decoding, which says Reaver, Jack, D period, E period, C period, D period on the canister to indicate that he's deceased. So the novel's problem of postage or postalness, what has come through the mail, is thus also a problem of what comes after, of postalness in the sense of generation, and of generational failures to link. Since Cooper hasn't seen his father in 20 years, his father walked out of his life after disrupting the sexual politics of the English commune he was living in the late 1970s and 1980s. The novel that follows is Cooper's attempt to reconstruct his father's life and legacy, to speculate as to what drove him to do the things he did, and to figure out who has sent him the mysterious package in the first place, an attempt that takes him across the United States from Vermont to Washington. Opening an ambitious, big, it's a 400-page novel, with someone at the heart of the military-industrial complex receiving a problematic piece of incoming mail, makes one think, assuming one's read him, of Thomas Pynchon, arguably the defining writer of at least American Cold War literature. Problems of mysterious postage underwrite Pynchon's fiction. As anyone who's read The Crying of Lot 49 will know, Pynchon's novel from 1966, this is a book about a conspiracy potentially involving a several hundred-year-old alternative postal delivery system called the Tristero that has played a role in international politics for several centuries. Pynchon's more obviously Cold War-inflected masterpiece, Gravity's Rainbow from 1973, is ostensibly about the V-2 rocket program and its effects, but has usually been read as an extended account of Cold War politics, especially the temporal problems of life in the Cold War. The irony of Pynchon's account of the V-2 rockets is, of course, if you hear them approaching, you've already survived, because they travel faster than the speed of sound. So you're dealing with technology that there's in fact no way to prepare for, no way to predict, which has been read as analogous to the problem of life in the Missile Age, obviously. And any number of critics have argued that the problems of referentiality and meaning enacted by Pynchon's paradigmatically postmodern fiction has everything to do with some of the ontological problems produced by living in a world in which total destruction was possible in an instant with no possibility of preparation for that destruction. And the novel is full of Pynchonian references. A mysterious package arrives and leads a protagonist to go on a quest to reconstruct a dead person's life, analogous to the plot of The Crying of Lot 49, in which Oedipa Maas, at the beginning of the novel, receives a letter informing her that she is the executrix of the estate of a former lover, and much of the novel is an attempt to reconstruct that former lover's life. So Cooper James is thus an updated Oedipa Maas for the post-9/11 era. A literary homage, as it were, repeated in another important work of recent fiction, William Gibson's 2003 novel, Pattern Recognition. I think both authors are suggesting that at this point we need to take a serious look back at some of the defining works of the postmodern and Cold War period and really reassess their validity or their value in the current moment. Both Gibson and Flint turn this adaptation into a story of familial semi-inheritance. As in both novels, fathers have gone missing. In Gibson, Case Pollard's father, who's a Cold War era security expert, actually disappears on 9/11, though no one knows he's dead. So these books are asking us to reassess what the genre of the paranoid systems novel that defined Cold War literary production in the United States might look like. What is recent fiction doing with the legacies of the Cold War? And what is the relationship to the paranoid encyclopedic style of Cold War fiction? There are numerous Pynchonian references in the novel. A key character is named Dr. Metzger, who helps Cooper James on his search. Metzger, a key attorney in the Crying of Lot 49, who helps Oedipa on hers. Those of you who've read The Crying of Lot 49 may recall that at its heart, there's an incredibly complex Jacobean revenge tragedy called the Courier's tragedy that seems to comment, as it were, on the plot of the novel itself. Though, as anyone who's read the novel will know, the play is almost impossible to reconstruct if you actually try to follow the political affiliations of various characters across it. There's a kind of equivalent in the Book of Ash, an early 16th century pyrotechnics manual. The story of the author of that book and the various masters he has served and betrayed is as involved as the plot twists at the heart of Pynchon's play. Pynchon's fiction is filled with amateur revisionist historians, and in the Book of Ash, Cooper's mother shares that interest, possessing a bookshelf filled entirely with what Cooper James describes as prehistorical hyper-speculation. And Oedipa's realization at the end of The Crying of Lot 49 that she might be the victim of an elaborate plot organized to send her on this quest is echoed in the Book of Ash, when Cooper comes to realize that his father was in fact dead when the container was sent to him in the first place. It was all an elaborate plan to see if Cooper had the detective skills to reconstruct his father's life. Both novels also have a consistent symbol that keeps reappearing across the two books. In The Crying of Lot 49, it's a muted postal horn announcing that alternative system of postal delivery, or rather not announcing that alternative system of postal delivery, given that it's muted. In the Book of Ash, it's the Eye of Horus, and I'll say more about that later. And there's an important moment of epiphany in both books. At one point, Cooper's journey takes him to Salt Mountain, which I take to be the renamed Yucca Mountain site in Nevada, the site that was supposed to hold nuclear waste in the US for long periods of time. Looking at Salt Mountain, Cooper suddenly understands what his familial legacy is, and the answer isn't familial at all. Quote, "Here, this is our legacy, this is our inheritance, mine, these kids, all the children to come." It's a particularly frightening epiphany to have, given that his personal story has seemed to open up onto a much larger story of a generation facing a problem and a threat that will in fact be faced by generations and generations and generations and generations to come. This is an echo, it seems to me, of a moment in The Crying of Lot 49 when Oedipa talks about how her quest to reconstruct her lover's life has led her to discover that the legacy was in fact America itself. And I think what's really interesting about Flint's work, looking back on Pynchon, is that he's suggesting that these two revelations are maybe the same thing. To understand America is to understand radiation. To understand radiation is to understand America. To understand that there is no aspect of national culture, in effect, not touched by the radioactive state. Now, I'm not interested in sort of tracing out Pynchonian reference after Pynchonian reference, and I assume you're not interested in having me catalog ever more correspondence between the two books, but really in asking now what we can do with this. And here I think this helps explain the interest in Accord in a way, and the interest in the visual more broadly in Flint's work. Pynchon's novel is fundamentally about reading. Its major interpretive dilemma is how to interpret literary text, how to interpret that play at the heart of the book. And numerous characters offer different interpretations of the play based on different critical reading strategies. And that interest in reading in Pynchon is both informed by the kinds of critical reading practices we associate with Pynchon, readings that are symptomatic, looking for patterns, and intense the interest in the various kinds of symptomatic disturbances in Pynchon's fiction, especially psychological ones. In the Book of Ash, though, I think we see an interest in a very different kind of interpretive strategy. An interpretive strategy that relies much less on reading and much more on seeing. because the book's interested in seeing the nuclear and the Cold War as everyday legacies, not as things in a sense to be decoded through a pathologically paranoid style of reading, but just things to notice in the first place. One character claims that what Jack Reaver did was teach them how to see, and that they needed an artist for that task. And as Cooper completes his journey, the novel repeatedly foregrounds acts of visual recognition of the radioactive everyday. When he ends up in Adamville, based on the communities around the Hanford site, he starts noticing that basically every business in town is named after some form of radioactive activity, for instance. And also it starts including images of these signs, for instance, names of sports teams, names of businesses. It's something like, following Hannah Arendt, not the banality of evil, but the banality of the radioactive economy. It's everywhere once you start noticing it. So the novelist joins a series of recent artists and novelists who sought to redirect our attention away from the problem of the instant that we so associate with nuclear unthinkability, the idea that the world might end in a moment, the idea informing Pynchon's work or DeLillo's work, to that of the multimillennial material legacies of the conflict. I think the novel joins, for instance, the directly political work of the Atomic Photographers Guild, or the way in which Don DeLillo's Underworld, which for 700 pages has been informed by the idea that the world might end at any moment, turns in the end to the problem of nuclear waste storage and nuclear waste disposal. Or Lydia Millett's 2004 O Pure and Radiant Heart. In that novel, Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, and Robert Oppenheimer reemerge in physical form in the post-9/11 era to account for the age they brought into being. And that novel gradually shifts our attention away from questions of instantaneous destruction to the long geological futures of nuclear waste. In a late scene in the novel, Cooper encounters an old associate of his father's named Lemery, and the discussion turns to conspiracy theories. And conspiracy is, of course, the term we always associate with Pynchon, whether there is or is not this postal conspiracy going back 300 years. And the language here is a little strong. I hope everyone will be okay with that. They're quotations, though, so it's Jim, not me. Lemery tells Cooper, look, what you failed to understand about your father is he was a magician. He was an alchemist who sought to transmutate radiation into art. Cooper's reaction is to dismiss Lemery. He's a fucking freak, he tells him. Nothing more than a Harry Potter nutcase. Talking about, dismissing Lemery. Just talking about magic and spells as he is. And Lemery at once seems to embody the classic conspiracy nut and critique that view. When he asks if Cooper knows about the, quote, true world government, end quote, Cooper replies offhandedly, yeah, sure, I watched the XFiles. You know what the XFiles is a show about, right? The secret state in league with aliens to take over the planet. Lemery's response, though, to this response is, quote, fuck the fucking XFiles. The XFiles is for losers and idiots, end quote. And by that he means the X-Files problem is not that it's a work of speculative fiction, but in a way it hasn't gone far enough. As Lemery goes on to point out, the plutonium economy, quote, crimes a good proportion of the world's major economies and controls millions of jobs and the destinies of billions of people. And because the product it creates is so dangerous and toxic that its existence is guaranteed for thousands of years, it becomes, in a sense, the underpinning of a transnational economy. Just to give you, one statistic, since 1945, between 1945 and 1996, the United States alone spent $5.5 trillion on the development, stockpiling, and testing of nuclear weapons. So if we've usually read Pynchon as a novelist who may be suggesting that vast conspiracies underwrite everyday life, in a sense, what Flint seems to be doing here is saying Pynchon didn't go far enough. In Pynchon, there was still the opportunity to not participate in the secret postal delivery system, to imagine it didn't exist. And I think it's significant here that, again, that the two symbols, the muted post horn and the Eye of Horus, in the two books. Because, of course, the Eye of Horus is on every US dollar bill. And the suggestion seems to be that to participate in the economy at all in the United States is to participate in a nuclear economy. The novel reminds us of so many ways in which the Cold War nuclear state was extended across US culture. The tract home, for instance, the essential unit of post-war suburban sprawl, was invented in Hanford during the Second World War as a way to house the massive number of workers who were brought in into Hanford, providing them a model for how to create the suburban communities that have arguably defined domestic life in the Cold War period. The fact that the ashes within the canister turn out to not be Jack Reaver's at all reminds us that the novel never completes the act of mourning its plot seems to demand, and that we might say the book shares with Pynchon a problem of closure. But in Pynchon, we're suspended just before revelation, quivering with anticipation to find out who the mysterious buyer of the stamps will be, and thus who has put this mysterious plot in motion. And we might read that end of Pynchon as something analogous to a kind of nuclear end, an end that comes without, as Derrida would say, revelation, apocalypse, unveiling in any way. That Jack Reaver, radioactive artist, never receives his funeral rites and burial, however, might speak to an equally unthinkable temporality of the multimillennium, as the waste that was his raw material also has never received the proper burial. We look forward here not to instantaneous annihilation, but, well, into eternity, as the Michael Madsen film would have it. So, Reaver's an alchemist, and I hope the metaphor of alchemy has informed this paper, that it's been a subject of this work of fiction, but also central to this fiction's form. The book is not simply an homage or a rewriting of Pynchon, but a serious attempt to imagine generational dialogue between authors. To the extent there is any closure, and this is what I'll leave us with in the novel, Cooper James does tell us at the end of the novel that for the first time in years he can breathe freely. He's been an asthmatic for years, probably because of participating in his father's own art projects when he was a child. And towards the end of the novel, his asthmatic lungs expands as he fills them with air. So you might think, here's an act of healing, here's an act of symbolic resolution. But of course, there's a cruel irony here, isn't there? The first time he can breathe deeply in years, he's downwind of the Hanford site. Furthermore, in a very clever move, he's downwind of the Hanford site right as a helicopter is landing and then taking off to take Reaver's final piece of art and drop it on the Hanford site as a memorial to the Hanford site. So of course, he's not only deep breathing downwind of the Hanford nuclear site, he's deep breathing downwind of the Hanford site as a helicopter's landing in a dirt field, thereby raising all sorts of presumably at least slightly radioactive dust. So asthma perhaps replaced with a very different pathology at this point in the novel. Thank you.